Then he looked me dead in my face and said, everybody deserves a second chance. I miss him.
Hello again to all and welcome back into the channel for a very special and in-depth Season 4 review. Now whether you're a casual Black Lightning fan or not, or someone who watches from time to time, you're more than likely not going to feel this next observation. Because if you are a diehard fan of the show, there are a lot of things that went wrong with this particular season. In this season review, we're going to put forth some definitive reasons as to why this is the case. So we're going to be breaking the season review down into 3 sections. First, starting with the plot, but more specifically, how certain plot threads factored into the overall story that was being told, the characters and how their actions contributed to the show, and lastly, we'll discuss the overall feel that you or I might have gotten this season from how the story was being told. Now while this video mostly will deal with each section in order, there may be some interconnecting going on between all 3 as I make certain points. So be careful for spoilers if you have not seen this season yet. And with that out of the way, let us get into this Season 4 Black Lightning review.
Prayer night for the helpless. Hoping you get us through breakfast.
So one of the main factors that shaped the plot for the first half of this season was of course sorting through the aftermath left by the Markovian story arc from Season 3. And one of those tragedies that resulted from the Season 3 finale was Henderson's death. But most importantly, how this affects Jefferson, our main protagonist, is what lends itself to the plot of the first 4 episodes. Now, of course, for those who are familiar with the show, it's like I said in my first episode review, Henderson was a key component to the show, and of course we feel the loss. So it is a plus that it got the emphasis that it did. Now exactly how it was handled is something we will have to get into in the following segments. But of course for the first 4 episodes, this was an issue along with the influence of Tobias. Tobias, for all his worth, does fulfill his role as the antagonist, and how he antagonizes Jefferson at almost every turn. Even to the point that Tobias antagonizes Jefferson within his dreams. Now yet another story thread from Season 3 that unwinds into Season 4 deals with Lynn, and how the show deals with her arc as a result of being manipulated to be hooked on green light by Odell from Season 3. But a lot of us had questions how this would affect her going into Season 4. And as it turns out, she ends up testing and using meta powers much like runway models changes their clothes. Anissa and Jennifer, of course, contributed to the story this season as Anissa waited for Grace to wake up from her coma, as well as getting married and dealing with those compromises that married couples have to deal with. But of course, one of, if not the biggest plot threads that had us all doing double takes this season is what happened with Jennifer going up to the ionosphere to recharge her powers and ended up getting jacked for her DNA and subsequently replaced. It wasn't until the last episode that it was revealed that the being that was masquerading as the original Jen, though different in appearance, was from the Glaze, and that she or it wanted to experience what it felt like to live. Now what we'll definitely have to focus on in our following segments is how this plays out and how it affected our viewing experience. But on paper, no one could argue that the overall plot sounds decent. The execution of it all, though, is what killed this season. Now let's not forget about the games that were ran by Lala and of course Destiny, who took over for Lady Eve. And yes, Destiny did end up hiring Ishmael, who was far more formidable in the comics. But who did he kill? A former Resistance guy from the first season? I mean, come on. And then he still ends up on Team Tobias, which, by the way, let's be real about that. Although Tobias was the star player, his team this season was trash. And Val, her usage towards the end of the season was virtually obsolete. But ultimately, I think what made both the expectation and delivery of this season fail one another was its premature cancellation. It was clear that the show writers for this season had to restructure some of its content, but there are some very telling pieces of news that I came across that will answer a lot of our questions. So while some might say there is no excuse, we can all agree that the writing suffered as a result of the cancellation that was announced a year prior while the show still aired in February. Also, if you realize there were no proper setups and equal payoffs. Like for example, since we started in the cemetery with Jefferson, he triumphs over it in the finale. Fine. But if we would have had just one scene with Tobias outside near that spike that he ends up suddenly falling on, or just showing one chick in his armor this season, though rushed, it still would have fit better. Now, even though we won't get into the specifics of every plot detail, I think we can all agree that Jefferson just was not himself this season. While Lynn's character and motivation did seem a bit undefined this season, overall, everything was a mess, which I think played into aggravating the weight of our expectations. But we'll get into the specifics of that in these next few segments.
You said that I've been acting different, yeah. Funny how I finally flipped the script on you. When you the one who's...
For drama, you gotta have people butting heads. And it elevates the drama when they're both, what they're saying is right.
Whether you may realize it or not, regardless of how many YouTube videos that you see are geared towards Easter eggs or little known minute details, the real reason why you and I watch movies and TV is for the characters. And more specifically, those subtle nuances that factor into how that character grows and changes and interacts with other characters. That's basically it. Now check this out. In an Entertainment Weekly article, the Black Lightning actor Cress Williams, when addressing how Henderson's death was meant to be handled, is quoted as saying, "I think it would make Jefferson even more cautious and scared of anybody else doing this stuff, his daughters included. The last part meaning Jefferson would be even more cautious to not let Henderson's fate happen to his daughters as well." Now obviously, this was not the case to how Jefferson was portrayed this season. Like, none of those moments appear on screen, which at the very least proves that our beloved characters did not even go the way the actor himself foresaw. And I don't want to assume anything, but I'm pretty sure Cress Williams had already read the original script and was giving us an idea of what was in it. Which can only mean one thing: something definitely changed. So, the type of brazen activity that we saw Jefferson engage in this season, which is not his usual modus operandi, becomes a domino effect plot and character-wise that in turn upsets Jennifer, causing her to travel to the ionosphere and ultimately leads to her being abducted. This also causes further problems with Lynn, which stymies her steps to overcoming her addiction. It also causes Jefferson to fight in an underground fight league. But if you think about it, since Jefferson constantly dreamed about Tobias, he could have been plotting on ways to counteract his arch nemesis, instead of wasting his energies in the fight pit, which still did him no good against Ishmael, a fight which Jefferson sought out himself. Seeking out these life and death situations is the opposite of being cautious, and I don't think anybody will disagree. And since the season was prescribed as being the Pierce family dealing with trauma, as stated in this article by the show creator Salima Kill, those therapy sessions should have been the result of trying to fix their off-brand actions, maybe towards the end of the season, not treating it like a band-aid on an amputated limb at the start of the season. There were times that Jefferson and Lynn were referencing their selves' actions in the third person, which was confusing. Now let's just review the decisions of our main characters as it pertains to character arcs. Jeff beats up 2 kids, participates in a fight league, doesn't do anything to preemptively stop Tobias until the penultimate episode, which he still gets put in a box, still wins. Lynn struggles with her addiction, still experiments with meta boosters, not to mention the drama between her and Jefferson lasts through the majority of the season, still a happy ending. Jennifer is always smiling like everything is going to be alright, like she's got the writer's own speed dial, gets kidnapped, comes back, still wins. Anissa admits at the very end,
"Sometimes I can be very stupid."
But this is not during a moment where she's forced to come to her senses. Her and Grace still end up happy. TC sets JJ up with a date, getting the poor kid killed. No scene for him to deal with the consequences of his role. Parties at the end. You see where I'm going? No accountability. Unfortunately, nothing they did this season felt earned. Instead of all that filler with the fight club, or the drama between Jefferson and Lynn, or the new suit scene, replace those moments with Jefferson killing someone and having to look himself in the mirror, or Lynn ODing and having to make a recovery that makes her look at herself, instead of her dreaming about killing her own family. Take the shock of that scene away, then it becomes a prophecy for the loss of their powers, or make Anissa more responsible for Darius's death, which would then give that statement a lot more gravity. But again, these were just some things that I saw, and I'm pretty sure you guys have way more than that, which will now lead us into how we all reacted to these character arcs. So let's set this up real quick. Altogether, there were over 20 principal characters that we saw come and go through the course of this season. Now the core six that carries this show is of course Jefferson, Lynn, Anissa, Jen, Gamby, and Khalil. And these characters have their own supporting cast, and Grace, T.C. Lauren, and then at last JJ, who we'll get into the specifics of shortly. But these aforementioned characters typically are the ones that you are supposed to root for. Now Tobias, Lala, and Destiny, on the other hand, have their supporting cast as well, who we typically should root against. So let me ask this question. Why then did I find myself rooting for characters like Tobias, Lala, and even Khalil in way more episodes than I actually understood Jefferson and Lynn's decision making, meaning the reasons why I rooted for Tobias and Khalil, or at some point even Lala, hoping he wouldn't be stuck in the concrete. The hope I had for them to pull through and exceed were far more substantial than what I actually understood Jefferson and Lynn even to be doing. And if some of that sounded confusing, that was the whole purpose. I did not understand what Jefferson and Lynn were doing the whole time. How does something like this even happen? Now other supporting characters like Detective Shakur, which is Henderson's stand-in, and even Chief Lopez, which we'll get into in a second, their roles were played fine. But everything Jefferson did, as well as Lynn, didn't seem like it worked or fit in. And the whole identity swap and how Jefferson reacted threw us all for a loop. Why exactly? Well, while trauma was supposed to be the root cause or the big bad, it came off confusing, mainly due to the writers not showcasing the characters' base traits to show us through meaningful scenes or dialogue that they were struggling but still somewhat intact, not just flipping crazy. They went overboard with all the shock value obstacles. It didn't mix well with the whole scheme of things. So now let's do a bit of compare and contrast with Chief Lopez, which I actually found her arc to be more compelling upon review. And we'll cross that with Lynn and Jefferson. Lopez immediately starts out with an agenda against metas, and then we later find out her husband was involved in a meta-related death. This had just about as much potential as any other character, including Jefferson and Lynn, because her motivations were clear and it was linked to a tragedy. Now her character was ultimately humiliated by an imposter and then also set right by the original Jen. Jefferson and Lynn basically had the same motivations. Jefferson's friend Henderson was killed and Lynn's sobriety was always in jeopardy. So why then was Chief Lopez treated differently? Simply because Jefferson and Lynn are the quote-unquote heroes while Lopez was the heel. And if anything, Lopez should have been redeemed. And yes, Jefferson, when they were trying to restore Jennifer, did say,
"Ever since the explosion, I felt Jen's essence, her energy, until now."
Calling back to our previous points, specifically the one made by Spike Lee, while Jefferson and Lynn argued back and forth and were mostly both right, Jefferson in this most critical moment was completely within his right to walk out on that imposter Jennifer, and everyone else, especially Grace and Anissa, who co-signed her, were wrong. But his walk-off comes off as abandonment. But what the show really tripped over itself was first having them make up and forcing them to pair up by the end of the very next episode. And I know there were certain decisions that happened to increase the impact of China McClain's return as Jennifer, which I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it. But now you gotta think about all of those scenes with JJ that led up to her being exposed. Now they don't really make sense, even if she has the original Jen's memories, especially the scene where JJ learns from Tobias, who was too perfect of an antagonist this season, that he killed Jefferson, which no one believed, even the characters. It was for us, the audience. And I hate to compare and contrast shows that are currently on but are not finished, but spoilers for episode 4 of Loki, if you have not seen it, you've been forewarned. But the two scenes where first Agent Mobius and then Loki were pruned, even though they are two of the main 3 protagonists of that show. Were it not for the end credit scene, for a brief few moments, we didn't know if they survived or not. Now contrast that with Jefferson's secondhand informed death by way of Tobias. Loki's was way more believable and far less confusing in the end. And given how I've loved this show since the beginning, this, among many other things, was a letdown. So, in closing, now the clip that's placed at the beginning of the season review is the attitude I actually hope many who decide to watch this show will ultimately keep. I have love for what this show represents. I've said as much in a couple of videos, but again, just not the way in which this last season was executed. And if you felt the same way, hopefully what was presented in this video will help you sort some of that out. And above all else, I think I'll try to remember the legacy of this show through the first seasons. And as usual, stay tuned in the Content Meta for more reviews just like this one. And yes, we are still planning to do those Black Lightning retro reviews with one caveat. We will continue to do them provided they do well. Again, thank you so much for watching, and until then, see you then.